It's sorry about that. But where we began tonight, where you said, about this, the education department being dismantled, and also all this investment that's going into by the big five or whatever you want to call,
The Mag 7.
yeah, the big Mag 7 now, right, et cetera, that's going into, AI and AI, products and data farming, if you will, and building data farms. So anyway, this is a mimetic fallacy that's going on because, as you say, they're building these abstractions, and that's what mimesis does too. And unlike in Marx, where abstraction is not a negative term, it's a dialectical term because you move from the abstract world of the commodity back to labor, to concrete labor, right, in a sense. And you need these processes of abstraction to actually get to the concrete. What makes the chair? What makes the desk, right, etc. Yeah. What makes the nuclear weapon a nuclear weapon? All of these things, are very much pointed out in Marx's description of his dialectical method, moving from the level of abstraction back to the concrete. Yeah.
Right. Which is not the flight from materiality to
No,
abstraction,
exactly.
but a
Exactly.
path from abstraction back to the material reality. Right.
For Marx, abstraction means the ideational level. You have to start there, right? And you move back down to, if you will, it's a descent. When he says, I'm turning Hegel back on his feet, that's what he really means, this inversion of Hegel, right? In some ways, right? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So
Okay.
anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
good,
Uh,
but you should go to the town. I mean, I'm sorry because
no, this is great. This is exactly what I wanted. I wanted to start with the
I've only
concept.
had a sip of coffee, so I mean,
Yeah, me too. Um, no, I wanted to start with Mimesis and unpacking this. So this is perfect. This is exactly what I wanted to do. We're doing great. So what my plan is now that we've got probably everybody who's going to drop in tonight in here, and welcome everybody. My plan is to get through chapter 1. Starting kind of slowly to try to figure out, starting from page 31. We got through page 30. So I thought we would start with social desire, fear, with that section, specifically defining mimesis, because it becomes a really one of the central kind of scaffolding concepts that he's building up, and really important to autogenetic sovereignty. And so I thought we would take a few minutes to work through that section, and then see what we want to do from there. Necropolitical culture is the next concept that I really want to kind of pause on. But that's what I was thinking. So if there are any other ideas, raise a hand or something. Otherwise, I'll read a few paragraphs, like the first page, 31 through like halfway through 32, just to get us started and get us kind of into the text, and then we'll take it from there. Does that sound good?
Mhm.
No objections? Good enough? Okay, cool. So microfascism, top of 31, is the realm of producing subjects, which involves the social organization of desire. So wars of subjectivity and the production of subjectivity becomes really important as we keep moving here. Desire is not a personal, psychological property, but always an assemblage, a socially produced force that shapes reality through material investments of energy. This, again, is part of the move from like ideas to bodies that we're also going to be following as the chapters move on here. It is not personal, but it forms persons. Thinking of fascism, Guattari foregrounds a micro-politics of desire. Long quote, we must abandon once and for all the quick and easy formula, fashion will not make it again. Fascism will not make it again. Fascism has already made it, and it continues to make it. It passes through the tightest mesh. It is in constant evolution to the extent that it shares in a micro-political economy of desire, itself inseparable from the evolution of the productive forces. Fascism seems to come from the outside, but it finds its energy right at the heart of everyone's desire. Fascist production of desire has often been understood as repression and channeling. John Protevi posits that desire, the movement of connection and immanence, is repressed by microfascism. In its place arises the strange cancer of 1,000 cells or self-contained units. While Protevi pinpoints the generic operation, the repression is specifically directed at a material that is gendered. Microfascist desire is a fear of dissolution of an order. Microfascist desire is a fear of dissolution of an order. Specifically, fear of a manhood misogyny. Okay, so how does microfascist desire, as specifically the central form desire in microfascism, is fear of dissolution of a manhood-centered order? How does that connect to mimesis? One area where this fear appears in the relation to the material realm is called mimesis. So, all right, so this is where mimesis is where this fear appears in relation to the material realm. Mimesis is the repetition and imitation that foundationally forms human beings. Rather than presuming an individual with consciousness, mimesis proposes that, as Benjamin put it, sentience takes us outside of ourselves. What he called the mimetic faculty is an openness to particularity, a mode of receiving the world of concrete objects and sensuousness. We live not as self-sealed individuals, but in relation to others and the world, primarily via mimicry. So just a little bit more here. The mimetic faculty involves copying, but moreover refers to the visceral bond connecting perceiver to perceived. Okay, so we've moved from, so we're very much in the relational and outside, like what goes on just in the head of an individual, right? Mimicry is not just a visual process of repeating an external form. It is transmitted and felt embodiment, a perception by feeling. Mimesis is a sensuous connection to otherness, whether other humans or the environment. All right. So as I read through this out loud, it's making more sense to me. Mimesis has been fundamental to Western thought, but primarily as the threat of nature against all things human. As Horkheimer and Adorno note, for civilization, purely natural existence, both animal and vegetative, was the absolute danger. Mimesis, it was said, was tied to the death drive, or the tendency to lose oneself in one's surroundings instead of actively engaging with them. So to lose oneself instead of actively engaging. Mimesis is coded as the sphere of passivity, of pure absorption into an environment, an undifferentiated realm where the human's special qualities are deactivated. This was a fearful confrontation of the consciousness with phenomena it could not control. So one more paragraph, and then I'll pause, and then we'll talk about how he connects this to autogenetic sovereignty. Resonating with the archaic positioning of women as lures, modern philosophy positions the mimetic realm as a danger to be overcome. Mimesis always beckons, luring the subject towards undifferentiation, so civilization developed abstractions, erected structures, even imitated mimesis in the form of magic. Abstraction in the form of knowledge is a violence, as it takes the place of the mimetic adaptation to the other. Abstraction is abstraction in the form of knowledge is a violence because it takes the place of mimetic adaptation to the other. These abstractions, often enacted through initiation rites, are designed to supplant the mimetic faculty. Okay. Anybody want to comment on any of that? I feel like I'm understanding a little bit better what Jack is setting up here and how he's trying to set it up. So there's a difference being articulated here between mimesis as a connection and adaptation to the world around us, and mimesis as kind of an escape, right, from that kind of connection or something like that. So the disruption of the mimetic experience of connecting and experiencing the world around you, something like that, having a relation to the world around you, is then disrupted. Potentially, is that kind of what everybody else is hearing? Help me understand what I'm hearing here.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the black holes, the lack of connectivity, and yeah, with the myth making and the detachment from reality, women are susceptible, or they have to be excised somehow. And I think maybe in another section it talks about how women give birth, but it's also in a way that it's not like it's life affirming. It's only like taking from them.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Anybody else? Great. Thank you, Jacob. Yeah. And really important connections, I think, being made between, right, mimetic disruption, and then the kind of elimination that has to take place. I think that's fantastic. Anybody else? Unpacking mimesis or how it's beginning to connect with abstraction and connection to the world?
It seems like there are maybe three terms that could be connected here. He doesn't say it directly, but mimesis and language,
Awesome.
and mimesis and affect.
How so? Yeah, I think you're right.
I think that's pretty important because the Benjamin quote, "Sentience takes us outside of ourselves." That gets us at the differences between affects and emotions. Which are external, right? The same way language is. And then the mimicry. Mimicry is not just a visual process of repeating an external form. It is transmitted and felt embodiment, a perception by feeling. So I feel like there he's connecting language or the capacity to speak, and this like imminent connection to the other, and dependence on the other, because just like 2 pages before it, the discussion was really about dependence. But then where I struggle is like, because if that's true, then how does it fit with what he says later about Kant and abstraction, and all of these things? So that's sort of an open question for me. But
yeah, do you want to skip ahead and then we'll skip back to it after what part of Kant where he talks about him on 36 or 37 or past that?
Yeah, I think so. 30. Yeah, 30. Let me see. 36 through 30. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, representation language is a type of objectification, and judgment becomes the basis for sorting the world, and specifically women's capacities through these judgments. So, I don't know for me, but it's not as if any one of these terms has a predetermined valence, as either oppressive or liberatory, as either like connecting you to whatever the common or oppressing others. I think it's they're there to be used as tools in a sense. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, we could read more from the Kant section.
Are you seeing? But so I'm trying to understand the like the short circuit or the disconnect between what he's saying in the earlier section and then what he's saying there. The representation is a type of objectification, and judgment becomes a basis for sorting the world.
Well, I think for me, I resolve it by saying that they're just forces in the world that can be bent one way or the other.
Okay.
But the confusion, to go back one step, was around like Mimesis already had like a close affinity in my mind to abstraction. So then he says mimesis is this connective sort of outside of the body but producing the body thing, right? But then later he says abstraction is actually the necessary move that the intellect makes in order to dominate the world, basically, right? And so that was the confusion, but I really do think it's not about like ascribing some like eternal function to these things. It's just about the way that they sort of are bent in this direction or that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking through. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The next sentences on 37 are abstraction is a flight that ultimately cannot flee as it guides operations in a reality shaping project. And that's the relationship between mimesis and abstraction is, what I'm sorting through as well. exactly as you pointed out, Tony, and the way that he's pointing to, like, not abstraction, but the relationship to the world that it creates, and sort of the alternative relationships to the world that can be like created or short circuited, I guess, to use like Stiglerian short circuit is okay. Yeah, I see that as it guides operations and real. Okay, cool. All right, yeah. So returning just for a moment, because I think this will help too. On 32, right where I left off, he then says, like, directly, what does autogenetic sovereignty, this like sort of micro-fascist form of sovereignty, do with mimesis? So, middle of 32, first, autogenetic sovereignty disrupts mimesis or sociality. So now, like, mimesis and sociality are like almost the same thing here, right? Okay. So disrupts mimesis or sociality through differentiation and fleeing the development of abstractions. Second, autogenetic sovereignty imitates mimesis, a mimetic meditation through divine abstraction that then gets mimicked by as man the creator, capitalized. Third, autogenetic sovereignty then imposes those imitations onto the social by reducing and subjugating. Okay, so it disrupts, it imitates, and it imposes. So it's still like engaging in a mimetic operation, but it's disrupting what would be sort of the social operation and then reconstructing it to create a new reality or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Neat. Okay. Okay, what do we want to do? Do we want to keep going paragraph by paragraph? On the next page, we get into gendered eliminationism, and eliminationism is another core concept. Does anybody have stuff between like 32 and mid 33 that they want to talk about, or I'll skip over to 33, and we can introduce this next concept of eliminationism, or whatever anybody else wants to jump to. If somebody wants to jump to something. I'm also curious, as we work through this, if we're thinking of examples from everyday life or popular culture where this form of like flight to abstraction or the demand to abstract, or like a disruption of connection and a demand to live within abstractions, like, takes place. This is a little bit what I feel like is happening in a conversation where you're at a poker table talking about politics, and a bunch of people demand that either you're going to say homelessness doesn't exist in America, or the conversation isn't going to continue. You know what I mean? And like having that kind of discourse with people, like part of that discourse was like having like demanding answers from me to very abstract questions, to which I would respond, well, it depends, and you have to be more specific. And then more anger because I was asking for more specificity, because why can't you just say whether something's good or bad? So like these kinds of like demands to live in the abstraction and to get away from the material reality, I think is fascinating, and something that's very present in micro interactions, like throughout the course of everyday life. Certainly at a poker room in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
I think I missed that story, but
I was so I played.
You were just having poker time with some bros.
Not some bros. I drive out to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, to play cards in a poker room on weekends sometimes, and it's an interestingly mixed room. But there's always a lot of like very MAGA conservative, very micro-fascist kinds of personalities, but sometimes very left personalities at the tables as well. It's really interesting. And I got into a conversation where three people decided to gang up on me and tell me that there was no homelessness in America, and homelessness was a choice, and addiction is a choice, and obesity is our biggest problem. So clearly, food isn't an issue, and there's no such thing as somebody who can't find food in America either. Yeah, and that kind of stuff. And then if I didn't participate, if I tried to make the conversation and bring it back to examples or whatever, there was a demand that I needed to answer their questions on these terms, and that's it. So and I like many of us, I'm sure, looking forward to the holidays. I'm going to be around a lot of people who are quite MAGA folks, and who are I think being described in lots of ways by Jack's book here. And so I find it like one of the ways that I look at Jack's work, as well as Adorno and Horkheimer and all of the work on fascism, is to try to help me decode what the hell I'm seeing in everyday life. And Jack's book specifically geared for that, I find. So if anybody has connections or examples as we go through this, please do share them. If nobody has anything else, I'll go to 33 and we'll talk about eliminationism and maybe where we see this in popular culture and everyday life. When autogenetic sovereignty comes back to control its source, it displays its microfascism as the ongoing and ubiquitous process of gendered eliminationism. Eliminationism does not refer solely to absolute disappearance or extermination. It signifies a reduction of capacities towards the null. It is an annulment, a nullification that needs to keep the realm intact as a source of social reproduction. The autogenetic flight extracts and feebles and subtracts and is thus closer to the necropolitical right to maim or a slow death. The spectrum of eliminationism involves debility and decapitation, belittling and diminishing. Debility and decapitation, belittling and diminishing. In sum, a negative relation to capacities. Autogenetic sovereignty reduces women through representation, what has been called symbolic annihilation, situated on a spectrum of eliminationism, including feminicide. Shoot, there's a lot there. I'm thinking of two things. Number one, going back to what Jacob said, that like we're continuing now to unpack this question of like what the black hole is as a personality and how it sort of creates itself or how it's created. And so this relationship to mimesis, I think, is really interesting. And then this relationship to like the elimination of things that don't fit the reality that's being constructed. So again, we're like, if we were having trouble unpacking the introduction of the concept of the black holes in the second meeting, we're beginning to get Jack's sort of explanation of how these things kind of work. The second thing is, like, I really enjoy the granularity of like how eliminationism works, right? Like debility, decapitation, belittling and diminishing, a negative relation to capacities. Jack throughout the book is talking about gender and wars of subjectivity, specifically against gendered subjects. He also refers to Lazzarato and Alliés and wars of capital, and they're more. They talk about gender, but they talk about wars of subjectivity against the sort of broader concept of liberation or emancipationist subjects. So like feminism, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, like these are subjectivities that are emancipationist. And it's those subjectivities that Lazzarato and Alliés are seeing as like kind of sort of constantly under attack. And so the granularity of the belittling and diminishing of liberatory capacities as like a rubric for studying popular culture or studying scenes from within everyday life or scenes from within public communications and things like that, I think of as very productive kind of rubric for asking how humor works, for example, in sitcoms. My students study sitcoms a lot, study films a lot. Like, what is the structure of this joke? What is going on in The Big Bang Theory, or what is going on in whatever popular sitcom my students are looking at? And how do we think of a joke within which somebody is being diminished or a capacity is being attacked in some way? I find really interesting. Anybody else? Anything about mimesis or eliminationism or anything else that anybody else wants to talk about?
I think here he sort of crystallizes something that I really find useful in thinking about fascism, which is that but also I reread The Psychological Structure of Fascism by George Bataille recently. And part of his point, and it comes out here as well in this moment where he's saying that it has to keep the realm intact as a source of social reproduction in order to attack it, in order to, to reduce its capacities towards, he emphasizes towards. Anyways, that fascism in general is a process. It's an ongoing process. There's no like, and this is something Bataille says too, there's no like settled state of fascism where it's like stabilized, let's say. Because then it just falls apart basically because it doesn't have this energy to both feed on and destroy.
Yeah, and fascism as a process makes me think also of like one of Jack's sort of points in here is to sort of force us to think about the ways that fascism sort of infuses, if it infuses culture in everyday life, then it infuses us as well. So as like, if we're thinking anti-fascism, we have to be aware that we're thinking anti-fascism from within a context, from within that context. Yeah, so from within some part of the fascism as a process, right? So like, we're trying to interrupt something that's also an ongoing part of the world that we live in as we're trying to interrupt it and understand it, because it's always ongoing and it always needs to be renewed and is never fixed and never settled, right? Like, which is also very Hart and Negri, and Jack has like very deep influences with the autonomia and all of that, and so this is very very Hart and Negri, and the like capital or fascism is never settled, right? Anything else about eliminationism? Anywhere else in chapter 1 that anybody wants to skip to or focus on? We're beginning to get into more details of how gender works here as well. I suppose, I mean, I skipped those paragraphs. Let me read those paragraphs too, where he goes through the Thevalite and he sets up what this like comes back to. So the paragraph I just read starts with when autogenetic sovereignty comes back to control its source. So what are we talking about controlling its source here? Yeah, so I'll just start back on 32. This dynamic of the flight and return embodied in autogenesis is spurred on by fear. Such a social desire inaugurates the modern subject primarily as differentiation from the feminine. So important paragraphs because he really starts building towards what's so important about gender here. Differentiation from the feminine, coded as the overwhelming capacities of nature and mimesis. So autogenesis thus operates to position a subject via fear of dissolution and absorption, both classified as feminine. Microfascist mimesis comes through fear of, flight from, and simulation of primary mimesis. Hostility to raw mimesis forms the autogenetic sovereignty. Hostility to raw mimesis. It's not just that the feminine is associated with materiality, but also that the feminine is removed from the binary of form and matter, which is determined by the masculine autogenetic sovereign who places himself on one side of the binary while simultaneously acting as controller of both terms. Okay. The foundational violence against women seeks to complete the project of flight from mimesis through vanquishing, even extermination. We can see the visceral fear and actions among the Freikorps. Klaus Develite notes that they were fueled by a desire for a bloody mass, and this gets back to Jacob, the relationship to blood, which also becomes really important here. Klaus Develite notes that they were fueled by a desire for a bloody mass while fearing the bloody mess that comes from women's bodies. To avoid being annihilated in fear and horror over biosanguinity, menstrual blood, the troops were compelled to enact a relentless pursuit of necro-sanguinity, massacre, rivers of blood. For Thevalite, masculine subjectivity emerges from a primordial fear of dissolution, a dread of engulfing potential of women, of the engulfing potential of women's bodies. For Kant, this is the error of the sublime, the terror, of the sublime. Origin myths, divine creation, man-God relations all stem from the horrible danger that one may lose all connection with the sacred and be swallowed up by chaos. All the abstractions are designed to keep this threat of chaos at bay. The circuit of affects and relations gets tighter. Dependency, fear, contempt. The social desire of fear, of the threat to the social order posed by women, generates the order, and its maintenance. That's what you were pointing to, Tony, there, the generating, and then so the social desire of fear generates the order and its maintenance. The place or topos of woman is thus essential. She is the cause of the circuit, the nature that must be fled, yet a continual threat to the order and abstraction produced through and as flight. The masculine autogenetic subject's compulsion to return is reframed as feminine, as seduction, as the dangerous allure leading to dissolution, as the terror of the sublime, which means returning to women via domination. The social returning to women have to return via domination. The primary social desire of fear is blamed on women, which allows all sorts of subsequent blaming to take place. He talks about Silvia Federici a lot. Is everybody familiar with Silvia Federici? And does anybody? I've read Caliban and the Witch, but I haven't read the other work that he refers to. Has anybody else read the Silvia Federici's other work? And like wants to speak to how it relates here.
You got it.
It's. I mean, it's.
Yeah.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, and women at
Go for
points
it, Michael.
is a good starting point. And also, as Matt can attest, there's a lot of stuff coming out from the Midnight's Notes Collective. I think I mentioned to you I ran into her at the dentist's office. It made my week last week. We had a really good interlude, about 5 minutes conversation, and we talked about Maurizio Lazzarato. She hadn't heard from him in a while, etc. So really great figure. And Caliban and the Witch is a breakthrough book. It's one of the first clever and best arguments from a radical feminist perspective of Marxism, and the whole notion of forces and relations of production. She really nails it in this book, right? And in many ways. And yeah.
Do we want to? Is it worth talking about a little bit what she does there, tracking
Well, I think what's interesting here too is what it's
Yep.
doing here with the figure of the feminine. If you go down the page on page 33, the flight return loop of autogenetic sovereignty is also enacted through substitution. And I think this is very important. I think this is what's been happening since this fear of the feminine, right? The reaction to the feminist revolution, if you will, how all this is play out. We'll see this more clearly in chapter 3 when we analyze masculine rites of passage, how so much conservatism came back, the frat house, right? The emphasis upon sports that I keep, chiming in about, etc. But the rights of subjectivity, this is very important, are developed in bands and warrior clubs. Fight Club would be a good movie to look in this context as well. In what Celia Amoros called patriarchal pacted groups. I think this is very important. And then are ratified by the figure of woman, right? In a sense. So, of course, I'm thinking, Calypso laughs in the tower at T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, right, in a sense. Always there's something, the figure of the feminine in terms of the poetics has always been there. And feminine, again, neme, the muse, memory, is feminine in the Greek language. It really is this fear, again, of real memory, real experience in some ways. It's very important etymologically to see that materiality of language play out, this fear of the feminine, very, very much, right? And in psychoanalysis, this was Alfred Adler who came up with a masculine protest, right, early on, which was a split from Freud because of too much emphasis, on the mother, right? Too much emphasis in, this notion of the oceanic, right? Yeah. Fear of feminine genitalia, another thing that was going on, that the sea, the oceanic feeling, were all associated with this. So I think he's really on to something here, because it's not only the eliminationism that's going on, but it's also the substitution, to read this, in terms of where it seems to me he's going here, to keep this in mind. Yeah. And,
yeah.
the figure of the feminine for René Descartes was the Queen of Sweden. She made him get up early in the morning to give lessons in philosophy and metaphysics, and he died. Descartes, because of this domination of nature, he died because he forgot his coat in the morning. He was accustomed to staying up late and getting up at noon. He liked to stay in his bed till noon, but the Queen of Sweden had him come to her residence, right, to give the lessons early in the morning. He died. He had pneumonia. He caught pneumonia. Didn't dress properly. So again, the figure of the feminine, in a more humorous way, looms here in many ways. But yeah, the calypso, the siren song, you can go through many examples, of course, in the in the pre-philosophical age in Greece and all the way through. And again, this whole notion of the femme fatale that's developed both in literature and really extraordinarily developed in film, right? In terms of substitution and eliminationism. And it comes back. And, yeah, yeah. Yeah, just ask your friends in Pennsylvania next time you go about who's winning in the divorce courts right now.
That's actually a relatively common
Yes,
topic of
yeah,
conversation
exactly,
among those folks. Yeah, yeah,
exactly.
and they're not happy with the power of women in divorce courts.
Yeah.
This is like
This notion of substitution, I think, is very, very important too. Yeah, yeah, very, yeah.
yeah. I want to connect to there's a couple interesting things, sort of random, the fraternity thing, Fight Club, and then the fear of memory. I want to focus on for a moment because Jack gets to this like in the last paragraph of
Right.
this chapter that I think it's worth in this context to skip to and then skip back.
Sure, sure.
I'll say very quickly though, one of the reasons I teach popular culture and critiques of popular culture is because it's a way to get these ideas across to students for whom they're new and might be shocking. And Fight Club is one of the movies that I see at least a project or two on in my gender, race, and class, in the media class. And a student who happened to be a white male athlete came up to me after class last week and asked if he could do Fight Club as a film. And he kind of abstractly said, it looks at like, problems in society and stuff like that. And he tries to articulate some ideas. And I say, that's a great idea. And I tell him, actually, Ed Norton, the actor, has done lots of interviews going into great detail about how he thinks about Fight Club and how he thinks about the crisis of masculinity and isolation and loneliness in consumer society. And Ed Norton happens to do interviews where he thinks about this very carefully. And the student said, that's great. And he'll look him up and all that kind of stuff. And the student was also shocked to hear that the actor in the film Fight Club had like a very easy analysis to offer that connected to the analyses that we were learning in this class. And so Fight Club is a great movie that's viewed by that was viewed by my student as just a movie that he enjoyed watching and didn't think about the isolation and the crisis of masculinity and all that. And is now finding a relatively easy path to seeing something like the genealogy of how Fight Club critiques and interprets the development of masculinity in the 90s and 2000s in America, right? So like the beginning of that student building re-engaging with a memory or re-engaging with the genealogy of critique is starting because they're working with this movie that they're relatively comfortable with. So thinking about that, thinking about memory and genealogy, the last paragraph of this chapter on page 53 says, "We are surrounded by autogenetic sovereignty, whether disembodied in fully black-holed subjects that unleash lethal violence, or as elements within our own masculinized social desires. Judith Butler reminds us autogenetic sovereignty only exists because this subject is itself the effect of a genealogy which is erased at the moment that the subject takes itself as the single origin of its actions. Understanding microfascism means re-invoking that genealogy as the palingenetic renewal of fascist man via the ongoing feminicidal war of elimination. It's a genealogy of war bands, necropolitical flights, and masculinized sovereignty. The genealogy elaborates an anti-fascist stance articulated so well by Thevele. We need to understand and combat fascism not because so many fell victim to it, not because it stands in the way of the triumph of socialism, not even because it might return again, but primarily because as a form of reality production that is constantly present and possible under determinate conditions, it can and does become our production. This production is more than the fascism in our heads. It's in our bodies, desires, and affects. With this concept, we can trace further the process where war, gender, and death converge. So going back just a few sentences, understanding microfascism means re-invoking that genealogy that is erased at the moment that the subject takes itself as the single origin of its action. So we can pause on this or go back and try to figure out, try to unpack what Jack's doing in that last paragraph by finding his sort of scaffolding up to it. But Michael, I was struck by the importance of memory here, and the importance of the short circuiting of memories, and I'm thinking with Stiegler as well, right? Like the importance of short circuiting memory and flying to abstraction in microfascism, right? The microfascist short circuiting of memory and flight to abstraction versus what Stiegler wants to talk about as intergenerational care, which I'm confident is going to be in interesting ways connected to the anti-fascist care that Jack sort of starts developing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I'm not quite sure where to go with it, but any comments from anyone, Michael or anybody else, about this relationship between microfascism, mimesis, the short circuiting of connections to the world around us, and the sort of necessary replacement of this genealogy with the notion that the microfascist subject takes itself to be the starting point of everything it thinks and everything it does. And therefore, there has no story, has no memory, has no history.
Is abortion ever explicitly mentioned in this book?
I'm not sure. Not that I'm recalling.
Okay.
But my recall on the spot is never very good. So it might be in here, and I'm just not recalling it. What's your specific thought about reproductive health and that kind of thing?
Oh, that seems like a very concrete realm that would be hard to abstract.
Interesting. Yeah. Any other thoughts? There's lots of ways. I mean, there's I've got to think about the many different ways that we might think reproductive health and control over the body, control over reproductive health, the state intervention in reproductive health in terms of in these terms, for sure, especially in a moment where it's illegal to seek abortions in I'm not sure how many states right now in the US. And where a year, 2 years after Roe v. Wade was rescinded, and there was not the general strike kind of energy rejecting such a thing, and we're still kind of living in this reality. So certainly it's an issue that we can connect and discuss. If Jacob, if you got connections or anybody else does, for sure. And maybe it's in here and I'm just not thinking of it.
There have been a lot of deaths, of course, of women, especially in the state of Texas.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of that in the terms that Jack's trying to create here between like the relationship to violence and the relationship to blood, and who has he goes to Agamben in a little bit here, but sort of who has the right over life and death, and who has the right to decide to live and let die, and all that, those biopolitical questions. Yeah, anybody see any other connections to sort of the biopolitical, Matt, in relation to the continuity of bloodlines as well? Be another challenge to male sovereignty, authority, and point of anxiety. Right. Yep. Absolutely. Do we want to go back and unpack a little bit?
Well, can I just mention?
Michael, yeah, jump in. Go for it.
I think there's a very interesting paragraph before the one you just read towards the end. Great. On the consistent militarization and necropolitical aspect of everyday life. He begins the autogenetic sovereign as homo-suicidal tendency, begins to answer Spinoza's question, what can a body do? Here it repeatedly goes to the limit in the process of destroying others. In that limit reality, it puts itself in danger to pursue the abstract glory of absolute victory. It's here we can a better glimpse Benjamin's understanding of the political relation of aesthetics to fascism, specifically as it produces a mediated collective body. What he finds is not the aesthetics of life, but of a core collective impulse towards self-destruction. Okay? So very interesting how, Benjamin, again, people that know the essay on Italian futurism and, the locomotive of history, which, we'll be engaging in this talk by Miguel Vator, how he really understands this collective impulse towards self-destruction. This is where the fascist futurist movement goes. A suicidal, homicidal melange in which self or elf alienation has reached the point where it can experience its own annihilation as a supreme aesthetic pleasure. So this is again this tendency of everything from suicide bombers. I mean, not to disrespect a practice that is part of a different culture than the West, if you will. But we have it here with the kamikazes. We have it with the soldiers on the front line, etc. This really speaks to the appeal, if you will, of what Junger called total mobilization, is what the fascist is so good at, right? In a way, his text should have been. I mean, in some ways, this is the mass psychology of fascism at work, how it operates, right? It needs a homo suicidal, right, tendency to answer what the body can do. And it's always being pushed to the limit, etc. And we all know the empirical evidence on, the new soldier training, given, super pills to keep them fighting machines for 7 days in case they have to do any land battles at this point, right? We know this. We know the projections of masculinity in the sky, in terms of nuclear warheads, right? We've all seen Dr. Strangelove and we laugh, but at the same time, it's serious business, right? Right. You talk about autogenetic sovereignty. Think of Slim Pickens riding the weapon down to hit Mother Earth, right? In a sense, right, as an image. So I think it's very important that, this is very, very important, and he begins earlier too. And again, you know how I feel about the anti-Oedipus work, how important it is. Speaking about Deleuze and Guattari on the previous page, Genesco says fascism's internal catastrophe was because it liberated the desire of the masses for their own deaths. And this is something that's not really remembered when we talk about fascism. That Donald Trump, in some ways, if you want to call this fascism, has us on a suicide mission, right? He has exposed, in my opinion, Trump is the most visible symbol of capitalism's death drive, right? And at this point, what's really going on, right? This is why this is so frightening. And maybe fascism isn't the right term. It's going further than that at this point. But anyway, going back here, in spite of themselves, right? This is the crucial thing. In spite of themselves, the collective subjectivity, necrophilic hostility to life, no longer operates via the masses, but by concentrated, and I think this goes into, I just did a review of the podcasts, right-wing podcasts, ranging from this idiot Fuentes all the way down to Bannon, how many they have, in a sense, the subcultures, the niches, and network actors, which are no less lethal or world-changing. So I think this gives you really a sense of a very objective structure that's going on. I think this is very, very good here at the end, where you can take these terms like, eliminationism and substitution, but it ultimately comes down to the question of desire again, right? And how this is totally manipulated. What's really going on? How that's Spinoza's question. How can the masses desire, right, their own destruction? This is really it. How have they been put in this position? And it's still a question. I mean, Jack Bratich is part of a long answer, right, if you will, something that still perplexes us. Why would people in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, basically say, okay, we're committing suicide, but they're not going to admit that because they think they're, yeah, they're really living, but they're not. This is part of a new a new form. I think Jack's describing new forms of necrophilia here too, affiliations with the necropolis, if you will. Yeah. So
And how do you think this relates to apocalypse? Like, it seems like most of the time, apocalypse is used by those on the right,
I agree.
even though the marginalized groups are experiencing something more similar to apocalypse. So is necrophilia different than apocalypse, or
I think that's really interesting, actually, Jacob. And like what appears to be sometimes an expression of like a right-wing desire for an apocalypse to be, for an end to be somewhere out there on the horizon, is really interesting, as opposed to the much more material experience of like living in Gaza and having to live through an apocalypse every day, or living in Syria through the civil war and having to live in an apocalypse every day. And then knowing that there is no like apocalypse, it doesn't end finally. You have to clean up and keep going if you are somebody who's still alive, rather than the right-wing notion of we have to be religious enough to fend off the apocalypse, this final end that will come for us all. So yeah, I'm really interested. Yeah, jump in, Michael, as well, of this notion of like a
Different
final end.
teleology of the right's notion of the apocalypse is that it's somehow a jouissance. It's sometimes a pleasure because it leads to rapture. This is the rapture. This is what's behind this. This is the motivation, in a sense. That's the right-wing notion of it. It's a different left-wing notion of what apocalyptic thinking is, in a way. Yeah, you yeah. So
I thought we might jump back while we're on this to Jack's unpacking of necropolitical culture. So like how he's getting to these last paragraphs, and he does that on page 36, I think, where he sets it up. I'll just read these really quickly, and then we'll have just a little bit more of an idea, and then we can talk about Evola maybe, because Evola takes up a big section of this chapter, and we should at least situate why he's in here and what Evola is doing. So at the top of page 36, while the loop of masculine autogenetic sovereignty is a form of life, it also generates forms of death. As Stevelite puts it, under certain conditions, this particular relation of gender production yields fascist reality. It creates life-destroying structures. So fascism and the death drive. As hostility to life, autogenesis operates as a self-preservation that is necrotic. One might puzzle over how death and self-preservation coexist. Aren't they in opposition? Not when the self of sovereign self-preservation is rooted neither in bios nor in associative forms of life. For that's the realm of mimesis and particularity. That's the realm of the feminine, right? But in abstraction and transcendence. The mimetic faculty, based on the senses, is geared towards self-preservation of both the individual and the social group, which is then lost in the autogenetic reversal, the flight from sense and mimesis into abstraction. So the flight to abstraction and the sort of death desire. Social desire cannot fully invest in the flight without cutting off life, so it returns to control life/women mimetically. The reproduction of domination via abstract schemas becomes a substitute for the reproduction of life and sociality. This substitution is already necrotic. It supplants life with order, concreteness with abstraction, and the world with God. Simulation enhances the necrophilic character of autogenetic sovereignty. Simulation enhances the necrophilic character. The deathliness of the microfascist subject here does not just refer to the elimination of the other, but to something more productive, a will to preservation without life. A will to preservation without life. Klaus
welcome
Stevelite
to
goes,
America. Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry.
What?
I just said welcome to America.
Welcome to America. A will to preservation without life.
That
Awesome.
should be the slogan now.
Yeah. Klaus Stevelite, just three more sentences to necropolitical culture. Klaus Stevelite goes so far as to call it a mode of production that continually transforms life into death and seeks to build a new order from a reality that is devivified. Autogenetic sovereignty is thus a doomed project of social reproduction through transcendence and flight. Instead of concrete social reproduction, the autogenetic sovereign is a creator in the image of a capital C creator that is a producer of life-destroying reality, or what will later be explored as necropolitical culture. Producing life-destroying reality, necropolitical culture. I'm thinking of a bunch of things here. One of the things that I'm thinking about as I was reading the second to last paragraph is the new movie. I mentioned this maybe the first week with Emma Stone called Begonia. Anybody seen trailers or seen the film itself? So the premise of the film is, I haven't seen it yet. Emma Stone is some kind of corporate executive. So some kind of like, she's a woman with power of some kind in the economy and culture. And she is kidnapped. And the narrative that justifies the kidnapping in the minds of the kidnappers is that she's an alien. And because she's an alien and is therefore plotting the destruction of the Earth, they must kidnap her and get her to admit she's an alien or whatever. That's the narrative. I haven't seen the rest of the movie, right? But to see like the flight to abstraction, right? This notion that like aliens are real, they're among us, they're doing things to us, and that abstraction then being the reason that we as a social body have to get together and eliminate this thing from our social body that happens to be a woman with power in culture. But we have to do it because she's an alien. So we have to, because aliens. So like this, like the abstraction proving the abstraction being the thing brought back to the concrete that the concrete is then sort of forced to comport with, I think is really interesting.
Reminds me of what happened to the governor of Michigan, but I forget what the story behind that was.
The kidnapping plot?
Yeah.
Yeah. Really good example, right? Right. The foiled kidnapping plot.
I think they had some rationalization for it that relates to this, what he's talking about.
Does anybody remember what the kidnappers were thinking? I forget what the reporting was on that.
I mean, certainly she was going to destroy America in some way.
Yep.
I don't think aliens were involved, but it was pretty crazy.
It was, well,
thinking.
as Jack points out somewhere in here that I think it's in here. Anti-communism and anti-feminism are always part of fascism and microfascism, right? And like, if Mamdani's a communist, then like who's not a communist, really, So the governor of Michigan, she was, left of Donald Trump and therefore probably a communist and needs.
You're talking about Gretchen Whitmer?
Gretchen Whitmer,
Yes.
Yeah. I see. Okay.
Who is no leftist, obviously. This is,
Yeah.
Okay, Michael, do you want to talk about Julius Evola at all, and like why, or does anybody want to talk about Kant and Evola and how they fit into this, depending on how much interest there is in digging into those very important moments of theory versus moving into to other essential concepts from chapter 1, or getting a start on chapter 2. Since we're a week behind, and we might as well. Or where do you guys want to go with this from here?
Well, unfortunately, my library that contains is 350 miles away with the Julius Evola section, or I would pull down some of it and do a little demonstration of what's in the books. Anyway, what I know of Julius Evola is one of the more intelligent and sophisticated right-wing Nietzscheans, that developed in the early 20th century, was a friend of Mussolini's for a while. He broke with Mussolini, but yes, he wrote many books on spiritual aristocracy. He wanted a return. He was one of these people at the turn of the century, and especially in the 1920s, who saw Western civilization had reached a point of decadence and needed a spiritual rejuvenation. He was part of the crowd, if you will. You could call it conservative revolution. Certainly could be included in a book with Heidegger, Junger, Carl Schmitt, and he begins the chapter, as you know, with Schmitt and the sovereignty of the state, right? In many ways. So, and Men Among the Ruins is Levola's longer, philosophical position. So this comes out of a right wing, and Nietzsche himself, if you want to just make, some reductive political terms, really hinted at conservative revolution. This is what Nietzsche wanted, really, was a transvaluation of values. I never understood the left's, appropriation of Nietzsche. I can understand you could certain categories like Lenin and others did in the Russian revolutions of the Ubermensch, as in a way, and you see the Ubermensch play out in the comics too. It took two Jewish teenagers invented Superman because they were reading about the Ubermensch in Germany, right? In a sense. So yeah, it's very, very interesting. I just haven't looked at him enough to give you a concise thing, but I think this is very interesting here because this was an existential, if you will, and it fits alongside somewhat with Heidegger, not completely by any means. I think Heidegger is a much greater commentator and teacher and mentor, if you will, to a different kind of moment of the generation. But if you look at the sense on page 38, in Ride the Tiger, Evola opens by asserting and elevating what he calls the principle of purely being oneself, right? And this whole pure being oneself also fit into what Adorno called the jargon of authenticity, which was, circulating during this time. And one can, look at what does authenticity mean? Is this a fascist concept? What ultimately does this yield, right, to this kind of return of the masculinist subject, right? And the masculinist subject position. So anyway, of living according to one's own law, this is, Nietzschean individualism in extreme, the law defined by one's own nature, right? Such grounding in nature is not in relation to any other being or the world, which is basically, in some ways, a subjectivist reading of Dasein in Heidegger, not really Heidegger in some ways, right? Um, uh, but rather on one specific being. Such a person, always a man, stands firm in turning his own being into a willing, making it his own law, absolute and autonomous. So this return of man, the legislator, right? The legislating subject is all part of the Nietzschean, moment too. The lawgiver, right? Going back in ancient history, right? In a sense, this is very interesting. In just a few sentences, right? He says, such a person, always a man, its own being into a willing, making it his own law, absolute and autonomous, right? So again, right? This return to almost absolute subjectivity in one's being, right? So in a few sentences, he gives the indicators of the circuitous logic he'll rely on throughout the book. You see in his explanation of self-grounding by making duty derive from power. Again, a Nietzschean moment, right? As the will to power and the thinking of Machen and strength, it must be exercised. For Evola, a capacity must be applied because it's an imperative of inner law, right? The content of that law is not to be established in advance, as that concern is up to the sovereign to determine. So basically, this notion, and I don't know, most people have read Deleuze's book on Nietzsche and philosophy, where he gives categories. The legislator next to the artist is the highest type, but the legislator is one of the higher types, right? In a sense, the lawgiver. And this goes back to, this individualistic, if you will, masculinist tendency to dominate nature, right? It's a complete revolt, right? In a sense. So, yeah. So then he ties this notion, if you will, to state form itself, right? This is setting up the great leader, the Führer, if you will, right? Or El Duce, right? In a sense. So this is part of the attraction during this period. You begin to see this, obviously, the attraction to these kind of figures through philosophy, how German philosophy was turned, especially, the notion of the Übermensch, right? The will to power, these Nietzschean categories, into a, if you will, a fascistic moment. And Evola didn't go out and just advocate for fascism. He's advocating, and in a way, his break with Mussolini was based on spiritual aristocracy, because this is, again, a more careful reading of Nietzsche, that Nietzsche wanted to establish politically somewhat a spiritual aristocracy, because he thought that was the problem really going on. And I think a lot of people shared that beyond the fascists during this turn, into the 20th century. So anyway, and again, this is a very deep problem, because again, Nietzsche in his later political thinking leaves Greece, right? And leaves the Greek city-state, if you will, for Imperium Roman. He basically, the type that Nietzsche thought was the highest type was Caesar with the soul of Christ. This is worth thinking about where we are, in some ways, I think, So, again, Evola was one of the better, I mean, this is worth reading, the whole section. I'm sorry, I don't have the Evola in front of me and could cite total passages, but he puts them into, I think, a very good context. This was the theorist, the best theorist in the beginning of making the new individual, the new legislator, that the head of the state. Like Kojève does with Hegel and Stalin, Hegel and Napoleon, Kojève and Stalin. He is doing here, it's Evola and Mussolini, Benito Mussolini, at least in the early days. Later, he breaks. I don't think Jack involved in those stuff. But this is the notion. We have notions in the leftist tradition of the new man. The dream of the whole person. But this was the new man to the fascists, right? Evola is promoting this very, very much as well. So anyway, I'll let you take it up from here, what you got from it, because again, I'm not, yeah.
No, that's incredibly helpful. Yeah, so he's like, through the section on Kant and the aesthetics of the sovereign, and then Julius Evola and the autogenetic sovereignty of the state, he's establishing what he's talking about as autogenesis, right? So the first sentence of the Kant section, second sentence says, in a nutshell, autogenesis for Kant is tied to sovereigns who get to produce reality and give birth to an order. And then the Evola section, just summarizing what you said as well, Michael, is just Evola's reworking of sovereignty around this individual conception of creating one's own reality and having sort of the confidence to live in one's own reality.
Right.
A couple sentences just around what you read. While Evola was a proponent of an aristocratic rather than folk-based fascism, his U.S. followers absorb his work-life self-help motivations to rise above developing a peculiarly American version of sovereignty. So, like, I think of this as fascism with American characteristics.
Yes,
right?
like that. That's good. That's very well put. In many ways, Evola is a forgotten figure. You put Evola along with a misreading of René Girard, you have the theoretical book par excellence of where we are today, in my estimation. I just one other passage I think is crucial, and kind of gives you a summing up of all this, if you want to cut to the chase, so to speak. Page 41. Evola's importance to microfascism and sovereignty is multiple. As a fascist thinker of sovereignty, he ties state authority to subjectivity. Okay? We mentioned this already. The mystical foundation of the state rests on the substratum of the new man, right? Very important here. An autogenetic, right? Genetic sovereign. Sovereign power gives and makes life, right? Quote unquote, now redefined as an abstraction and as a political order. It also operates in the moment where the self is abolished, right? If done for sovereign reasons. The new man gives life and controls death, right? Even his own, right? This is very important here, right? Given that so much of his work is a study of traditionalism, sovereignty emerges prior to the rise of the modern nation, its archaic practices such as Roman imperial action. Let's pause here to digest the significance of this when it comes to the usual equation of fascism with nationalism. Evola takes great pains to distinguish his idea of imperial sovereignty from nationalism. Very interesting. It is not that the two are merely different entities. He sees them as opposed. And this is interesting. This may be Nietzsche too. Yeah, his reading of Nietzsche. The nation will always be a promiscuous entity. On the one side stand the masses, in which, besides changing feelings, the same elementary instincts and interests connected to a physical and hedonistic plane will always have free play. And on the other side stand men who differentiate themselves from the masses as bearers, right? And this is obviously Ebola, bearers of a complete legitimacy and authority, right? Bestowed, right, by the idea and by their rigorous, impersonal adherence to it. The idea, only the idea, must be the true fatherland for these men. What unites them and sets them apart should consist in an adherence to the same idea rather than to the same language or blood. This is the Sadian Salo. This is the 120 days of Sodom in a theoretical framework, to my opinion. This is Pasolini 101, Julius Evola giving you what the fascist desire is really about. Yeah, in some ways. We always use it as a term for Nazi Germany or for, this goes back to Imperial Rome, right? In many ways. So very interesting here. Yeah. And, Trump could be, in a way, our Caligula, right? In some senses. He kind of lives like it. I'm not trying to mythologize this, but, or dehistoricize it too much from the present and put it more into traditional moments. But this is what these minds were really about. They believed in these myths. They wanted a regeneration of this under the auspices of a new man. And this was not a myth where you're going to lay down the arms and say, welcome Penthesilea, the warrior of the Amazon, women, et cetera, where everything goes. Yeah. So anyway, I think, again, very important, rather than nation, ethnicity, territory, which anchors in God's the sovereign, is the idea, almost a Platonic abstraction that unites subjects, right? The idea. Going back to this notion of apocalypse, that's an idea, right? It's, in a way, this kind of new, yeah. I mean, as some people mention, apocalypse every day, as you did, David, in Gaza, right? Every day. Worse and worse every day. Sudan.
I think immediately of the abstraction that unites the subjects of conversation over a poker table where it was demanded of me to answer whether or not America is the greatest country in the world.
Okay, good.
I really demanded yes or no.
Okay. Well, you better bring some muscle with you next time. Sometimes, this is why, I mean, they weren't stupid, the German Nazis. They knew that the communists had power, that they would fight. So that's one of the reasons they wanted to eliminate them first, right? Yeah. So,
sorry, I was just on a delay.
mind, I'd just like to go on because I think this is a very crucial understanding of Evola and how it fits into the general thesis of the book. For Evola, the tale of modernity is the fall of the empire into the nation. So here we go. Fall of the empire into the nation. What do Hart and Negre do? They want to argue against the nation state in the name of an empire. And they go back to Polybius, right? A Roman historian. If you read the book carefully, there's a lot of traditional thinking that's going on in empire too. I'm not saying that's their thesis. That's not the point. The point is that they're well aware of this distinction that's happened, in the history of ideas, if you will. It is no wonder that the restoration of sovereignty is a renewal of man in the spiritual sense, right? I'm at the top of 42, right? Is yeah, a tradition that is untouched by the decline into modern institutions, including nation and land. The gendered essence of autogenesis becomes clear when Evola characterizes the state being under the masculine aegis, right? While society, and by extension, the people or the demos, are under the feminine. You see how this opposite, I mean, it's very interesting how these guys think. And they're not stupid. Remember too, we're reading this as a kind of archaeology of the present. Just think about how these people, these postures, the way people are acting, the whole thing around Trump, how he always has everybody dressed in the suit behind him, right? Everybody's got squared up shoulders. The women are dressed like men, really, in a way. I mean, in a sense, right? Bondi is dressed corporately, right? Yeah. Who knows what Noam's dressing like? She's lost in some 70s disco, but anyway, I'm sorry. Yeah, the Homeland Security, the disco of the 70s. But anyway, yeah. So this is again very important here. Once again, this is a primordial truth, right? This quest for the primordial, right? Uh, the maternal domination from which the political virile principle subtracts itself. And here I'm going to tell Jack when he comes back, he could extend this paragraph into a book that incorporates Machiavelli. The next study, right, is really very interesting here. How much of the notion of vir plays out in 16th century Italy in the formation of the nation state. It's very interesting, right? Machiavelli's vir is very different than the Greek arete, the virtue, and of course Christian virtue. Now, of course, it's translated as virtue in some ways by most people. But anyway, going back, it was also understood the virile subtracts itself, was also understood as the domination of Mother Earth and the mothers of life and fertility. Man's metamorphosis or progress from lowly man to leader is thus a subtraction, a flight. This differentiated reborn man becomes the foundation of state authority, right? Very, very interesting, right? This, yeah, as the political virile principle, again, right? As the political virile principle. Microfascism is thus profoundly tied to a flight from materiality, again, even into abstractions, but even spiritual forms. He repeats, his thing. One understanding that the autogenic sovereignty as microfascism has found itself in a fascist philosophy that is also a philosophy of gender. Evola lays out clearly the microfascist realm is the primary one, not an auxiliary dimension of state power or a stage. This takes on a whole Marxist tradition here too, again, right? Yep, yep. As a stage of absolute authoritarianism. Again, he's also taking on here, and this is another good point to ask him coming back, this notion of the new authoritarianism, right? And he's got this down. It's already in these principles that are back in Evola.
Do you want to say just quickly, Michael, a few more words about its situation within Marxism?
Well, this is not a Marxist attempt.
No. But I mean, it's what it's playing with. Yeah.
It's playing with the somehow the Nazi and Italian fascism were corporate reactions, right? Or there was part of state power was always part of new concentrations of capital, right, etc. He's looking at it much deeper than just how the state, absorbed all of these things, right?
Right. Yeah, just another way of saying the reversal that he talked about so much, that culture comes first. So he's not looking at how state
exactly.
or economics
Psyche comes first. Really, psyche comes first. He doesn't use the word. He doesn't use psychic, power in some ways here, but really, in a way, this is a psychic, right? If you will, hyphen cultural study, in a way, of what fascism is. Microfascism has a tremendous amount to do with the psychic. Yeah, I mean, constantly going on, and how it becomes impoverished, you know, in everyday life. I mean, this is what, the internet, we would deal with this in Stiegler if, a very, so one of my headings for Stiegler is further studies in psychic impoverishment. This is what's going on. We're being impoverished psychically by all these new forms. This is what AI will do. It will finally be the last stage of the psychic impoverishment that began very early, yeah, for many, many decades where we were living, right? In fact,
Yeah.
the 60s could be seen, at least to my mind, and again, in part of the 70s, as a revolt against psychic repression, right? And really opened up the floodgates, if you will, of what had been held back, where the barricades had been put for so long. Even though you can see rebellions against this, historically, especially in the 50s among the Beats, Burroughs, others, the jazz, as I like the jazz world, other forms that are going down. So for me, again, this is very, very important that goes beyond, this is much more coming out of the tradition of Deleuze, Guattari, and Foucault than it is really coming out of Marx, Althusser, Poulantzas, et cetera. It has this, genealogy in which the new concepts are, developing. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
in my mind. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the elsewhere and earlier, Jack was in writing exploring the notion of the noopolitical that
Right.
comes from autonomia and everything, like this war for the spirit, something
Right.
like that, or like yes, psychic war, spiritual war, that kind of thing.
Right.
The noopolitical. So I'm sorry, Michael, I interrupt you. You were just
No, it's okay. No, I'm just trying to, Evola is a very, very important thinker to know about. We have a tendency on the left, and most of my colleagues and friends, comrades are this way. They only read the leftists, right? This is a problem. I mean, yeah, it's good to arm the, put the right bullets in the chamber, of course, but at the same time, you got to know how the bullets are pointed at you too. And these are not flimsy speakers. These are very important people, the Ebolas of the world, right? In a way. Yeah, and remember, Mussolini started as a socialist. He was friendly with Gramsci, then had him arrested. He had Gramsci arrested on the halls of speaking of the nation state. Gramsci was on his way to vote on the death penalty in the parliament, in the Italian parliament, and he was picked up by the Italian police, by Mussolini, and then he was given things basically called a traitor. Yeah, he was convicted on grounds of treason to the fascist state. What the judge read. You think that our judges are crazy? Think about this. When he read the sentence for Gramsci, he says we have to stop this mind from working for 20 years so we can get on with our program. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I'm just thinking about
Marx
how
is a great anecdote to Evola, of course, right? As is Labriola before him in the Italian socialist hyphen communist tradition, and this opens up a whole new, another, the highway of contradictions. But anyway, I think this is again to know Evola. I think he has them here for a reason. That's the whole point. I mean, he devotes 6 or 7 pages, and then later too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think what we're seeing overall, right, is this definition, first of all, of autogenesis and the autogenetic sovereign, and then Evola's articulation of something like an autogenetic sovereign as the sort of central figure of the new man, and that so now we've got this subjective sort of figure that in the like ensuing sections of this chapter is going to be desensitized, right? And then is going to be networked. So no, they're going to be desensitized, they're going to be trained for battle, and then they're going to be networked. And that's what happens in the next 3 sections.
That's true. And he's also setting up this concept of the Mannerbund, right?
Yep.
This is very important, and he goes back to this with Ebola later in one of the last chapters. He returns to this in terms of Trump and Trumpocene, if you will. And this book's written before Trump, earlier, Trump 1.0, as they like to say now, age of computers, right? Now, yeah. Anyway.
And the next chapter, the subtitle is Ancient Misogyny in the Microfascist Manosphere. So we're establishing the kind of subject that we're talking about here. We're establishing how that subject sort of experiences something like, something like a trans individuation or a class formation or something like that around the idea, something like that to bring in concepts that are foreign to what Jack's using right now, which is to think of Stanley and Spiegler and how we think of these movements sort of cohering. So this subject, we see how it's constructed, how it's desensitized, how it's trained to fight, and then how it forms this cultural sphere, this microfascist manosphere, is the next chapter. So in the last 10 minutes we have, let's just spend a few minutes. There's too much to cover, but a few minutes talking about just these last 3 elements, right? Like Walter Benjamin and the idea of desensitization, then the sort of digital shock troops, the trolls that are fighting for sort of cultural domination, and then the way that those individual autogenetic sovereigns are networked into a mediated collective of black holes. I don't know how much of that we're going to be able to cover in 10 minutes, but I think that's an okay summary of the last 5 pages of what Jack's.
If I could just go back one more time, I'm sorry. Please. Desensitization, right? As part of the thing. If you look on page 43, fascisms and aesthetics of embodiment and masculinity have been well documented. Velasca Zamboni, also noting Kant's gendered aesthetics, argues that fascism relied on feelings and sentiment, yet strove to neutralize the senses. It's very important, right, in a sense. And Benjamin, of course, sought to account for a range of embodied experience and sensations resulting from World War I, as well as the everyday upheaval brought about by industrial capitalism. This will go back to the Marxist discourse. For World War I, popular medical discourse promoted the idea, of course, of shell shock. And this was one thing that fascinated Freud, by the way, and I think really furthered his understanding of human being, of wartime neurosis, trauma, the wartime thing. This is some of Freud's most very powerful writings during this period, to identify a dynamic between numbness and shock as central to subjectivation at that time. And this is another thing that media, should study, is how much numbness and shock goes together in the production of streaming services, the sporting world. It's how much of this really goes on to where we're almost completely desensitized, right? And this process of no longer actual healthy sublimation, but we're completely desublimated, right, into the object and the image world. This is, again, Debord, Deleuze and Guattari understood this, I think, very well. How the spectacle takes over everything, the simulacra, right, in a sense, right? Yeah. So anyway, I'll let you go on to your conclusion, please.
No, I think we're concluding. You're doing it. The next sentence. I want to read the next paragraph because the word mediated is introduced, and how these things get mediated becomes so important. Jack, finally, is a media studies theorist, right? So mediated embodiment, Benjamin posited, was an effect of image bombardments, as well as the technological experience that attempted to manage that assault on the senses. In a nutshell, the embodied subject was an interface of numbness and shock. For Benjamin, this was a result of modernity and not just fascism, which instrumentalizes the dynamic of stimulation and detachment to produce its collective mediated subject. He extended the experience of shell shock beyond the context of Great War veterans to describe everyday life under accelerating capitalist mass consumption, in which the phantasmagoria of culture distributes numbness and shock. And yeah, I'm thinking of doom scrolling here, Michael, in the terms of what you're saying, like how the internet, like numbness and shock is what doom scrolling is all about, right? Like you scroll and you scroll and you scroll, and for some period of time, you're seeing things you're used to, and then you see something shocking. And then you got to scroll more because you were shocked by something. Maybe you'll be shocked by something else. And this like dynamic between numbness and shock is very much the at least one way I think to think about the sort of doom scrolling dynamic. I have students every semester who ask for advice on like how to break addictions to social media, who talk about doom scrolling and who talk about this in different terms, but who talk about the experience of like losing time and not knowing. So they just go and they're separated, but also they're feeling these very personal little bits of shock at the images that they're seeing, whether it's shockingly cute or shockingly violent or shockingly whatever. And so, yeah, the expansion of this technical system and its expanded sort of capacity to produce numbness and shock, I think, is really important.
Interesting. Yeah.
And within that system of numbness and shock, the section that starts on 44, we have digital numb troops. So for Benjamin, the numb shock dynamic was distilled in the Great War. Today, we note that war is imminent and pervasive. Global civil war, holy war, global war on terror, dirty war, and cyber war, in addition to the conjured ghosts of the US War of Independence and the Cold War. All of sport is presented as some kind of a war. The athletes have to be so pissed off and like ready to rage no matter what sport they're playing. The expression of rage is mandatory now. You know, everything's war. As this book foregrounds, the primary war is a war of subjectivity, specifically a war on women. And this war, with its shock/numb troops, thrives in online spaces. Within digital culture, yeah. Okay, so with 5 minutes left, I propose that we talk about digital spaces, mediating black holes, and then jumping into chapter 2 next time, because I feel like there is the potential for a very rich discussion around what's going on online and how the sort of online digital cultural space is. He doesn't mention Gramsci here, but is a kind of Gramscian terrain of struggle. And so we'll talk about that terrain of struggle and the subjectivities that are participating in struggle on that terrain. And then we'll move into, what was it? Ancient misogyny and microfascist. What was the subtitle of the next chapter? And the microfascist manosphere. Right. So that'll be the beginning of our exploration of the microfascist manosphere, is the digital shock troops. If that's cool for next week, so we'll leave off here.
Yeah, sure. I just want to recommend a movie. Again, Johnny To, the great Hong Kong director, Exiled, deals with these kind of pacts and masculinity, warrior culture. But interesting thing, ultimately, it's completely guided by the feminine in the end. Yeah. So I think he does a magnificent job about this, about how pact, bro culture is created, really comradeship in a different way, because it's about a gang that has to hide someone that the triads are after, right? But ultimately how they keep escaping, but they'll fight on behalf of his wife and child. It's a very interesting film with a lot of these themes. Yeah. And he's a magnificent choreographer of violence too. He's one that really shows us both how indifferent and numb we are, but at the same trying to shock us back into this feeling of how much violence is pervasive out there, right?
Mhm.
What's going on? So
Mhm.
I'm sorry.
You mentioned initiation rites and fraternities earlier, and I grew up in a very conservative sort of proto-fascist culture, and accepted it as common sense until my early adulthood. So I was in a fraternity in college at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, and the traditions, the initiation rites were fighting and self-abuse. And it was like there was a fraternity that was an enemy fraternity. Every fraternity had their rivals, and there had to be massive fights at least once a year between those fraternities. So it was very much about like proving that you were willing to punch people in the face for your fraternity, for who the hell knows why, the nonsense. And the initiation rites, I was in what was considered one of the more tame fraternities on campus. The fraternity that was the wealthiest fraternity on campus had the reputation for being the harshest for its initiation rites, and they got into very deep sexual violence, like very serious sexual violence, and people quit in the middle of it. So like the whole campus knew about it, but that fraternity didn't get messed with because they had the biggest donors, the alumni donors that were funding it. Our fraternity, the tame one, for our rituals, we had to drink until we threw up one night, and then the next night we had to drink until we threw up again, and then we had to strip naked in a fraternity basement. And be lay on the floor and roll around while we were covered with like liquid garbage that the brothers had collected for like a week or two. And then we had to clean up, and our big brothers went through a paddling ceremony where we were again stripped naked and then beaten with a paddle. And this was tame Lafayette College, we're a Patriot League. This was the tame fraternity in 1996 or whatever, and completely normalized. And the kids who quit were seen as like a sort of different category of person who hung out at different places and on a college campus where all the social life is fraternities and there was nothing else going on. So I take very seriously the notion that the war is absolutely pervasive. And folks who are being exposed to it, like me at 17 years old, are being exposed to a very serious, very physical, very violent war without having any idea that they've walked into a terrain of struggle or having any idea that their bodies are being sort of fought over or attempted to be created in these ways, just sort of caught up in the machine. So yeah, that's my story from the manosphere, from the micro-fascist manosphere in the late 90s, anyway.
Right. Yeah. I tell people in my neighborhood on their way to the gym, happy reading on the treadmill. Yeah. That's what they just plug in. Their books by what do they call those audio books? They put the earplugs in or whatever, music, etc. Yeah. They spend an hour every day in the gym, right? Before going to work, etc. This has been part of this, one of the slogans during the Reagan years that kind of it started right before the Reagan years. America is getting into training. That was the slogan that kind of anticipated the Tina syndrome, right? In many ways, and the Reagan Thatcher moment, and yeah, America's getting into training. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, which is like the first as tragedy, then as farce kind of thing. Pete Hegseth's like "Get Rid of All the Fatties" campaign is like a very interesting intensification and echo of the Reaganite notion, right?
right.
All right, cool. So 9 p.m. Any final thoughts? If not, then
Thank you
we'll
for turning us on to this book. It's a magnificent,
Yeah.
thought-provoking, and there's just so much here to work with. And again, yeah, and he's really delved into the archive in an extremely rich way. Nobody talks about Julius of Orleans, at all anymore, except in sometimes professional political philosophy classes, circles, but very, very little thought about Julius Evolia, Evolia here, right? Yeah. And he's much more intelligent than Gentili. If you look at the Italian right philosophers, Evola is the top of the line. I mean, he's a very good writer, by the way. Very good writer. It's not like you're reading, Nick Land's The Dark Enlightenment or Curtis Yarwin or some of these clowns. Nick, what's this idiot's name? That guy should be taken out to, yeah, I can think of all kinds of fraternity tortures beyond. I'll evoke Robespierre and Stalin in this moment. This Nick Estes, is that his name?
Fuentes.
Yeah.
Fuentes, yeah.
Fuentes.
Although he might desire his own destruction and enjoy the fraternity torture.
Yeah. You may be right in some ways.
Nick Estes is an indigenous scholar. Nick Fuentes.
Oh yeah, that's right. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, my bad.
Thanks everybody for participating. I'm glad everybody's liking the book. I've got a little bit more time this week, so I hope next week I'll have a little bit more of like a discussion guide planned. But this has been great. Yeah, thank you too, Matt, and thanks to everybody for being here. And I hope it stays interesting for everybody. Okay, have a great week, great holiday if you're celebrating. See you guys.
Tomorrow night. Okay, thank you.
Oh yeah. All right. See you tomorrow.
And I'm going to put out. Some of you may have got the announcement that Miguel Vater will give a very intelligent talk. I don't know if it went out to you guys, but it should be out in circulation. The announcement for his talk. It'll be online as well as in person on Friday, December the 5th. But I'll give you a heads up. I'll send to the group tonight the flyer that went out. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Michael.
Good. All right.
Okay, cool. See you tomorrow. Bye, Jacob.